Good morning. Happy Thursday. We have looked at a lot of material thus far this week, focusing on the Cold War. From what I sense in class from our review, you are getting comfortable with the concept of the Cold War. This competition, this tension between the United States and our allies, and the Soviet Union and their allies. Let's take a second and look back at this week. On Monday, we looked at the Cold War and what was going on in Southwest Asia and South Asia. On Monday, we looked at what was happening in Europe following World War II with the Cold War. And then yesterday, we looked at such a hodgepodge of information. We looked at what was happening in East Asia. We looked at what was happening with Cuba. And we were also looking at the nuclear arms race that initiated when the Soviet Union developed their first atomic bomb in 1949. Today we want to continue that focus of this competition, this tension between the two world powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. But today we'd like to focus on outer space. So let's begin today looking at just simply what was the space race that occurred between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Well, the space race, this competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, was basically over who could get into outer space first. Who could reach the moon first? And then who had the ability, the capability to be the first country to land on the moon? Oh, so many implications from the space race that we can tie to this whole concept of Cold War. And finally, what country was going to be the first to be able to explore beyond the moon? Now, when did this space race begin? Oh my goodness. It began in 1957 in October, but in many, many ways we can say it began before that, with trying to figure out how to build a missile. Germany was the first country to figure out how to build a missile rocket. They were using them during World War II, in the last days of World War II. The Soviet Union and the United States, after World War II, when we were gaining control of Germany, we took German scientists. So the Soviet Union took German scientists. Both countries were competing, trying to figure out how to build a workable missile. But in October 1957, the Soviet Union launched their first satellite, Sputnik or Sputnik 1. If you join me in Washington, D.C. next summer, one of the places we will go is the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, and you will see an actual replica of a Sputnik, no bigger than a basketball. But the Soviet Union had developed a way to put this small satellite into space. Well, let's ask ourselves, who really cares who can get up into space first? Why is it such a big deal? Oh, we have to think about this. Let's look at what motivates the race. It's competition. Who's better? Who can come up with the best system? See, if you can build a missile that can break through the Earth's atmosphere, and if you can develop a satellite, then obviously you have developed strong minds in your country. You've developed a good educational system in math and the sciences. So why does this race matter? Why is there competition? Who has the better education system? The United States or the Soviet Union? Who can take knowledge and apply it? Who has the better technology? Who has the better engineers? Who has the better scientists? Now, we need to take a second and talk about missiles. If you have a missile, if you develop a missile powerful enough to break through the Earth's atmosphere, then don't you also have a missile that can go from one continent to another continent, or what I like to call ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles? And what can you attach to missiles but nuclear warheads? Are you starting to see why this space race is important? So let's look at some of the major events in the space race. We don't have time to look at everything, but I do want you to focus and know a couple key parts of this space race. We know that the space race began in October 1957 with the Soviet Union launching successfully Sputnik. Well, several months before Sputnik, the Soviet Union announced that they had successfully tested an intercontinental ballistic missile. They developed an ICBM before the United States. And then 2 months later, they're able to put a satellite into space, and we weren't able to complete that before them. Well, a month later, in October 1957, the first animal was put into space. Now you might think to yourself, animal? Why put an animal into space? Think of all the implications of what that means if you can put a living being into orbit. Again, completed by the Soviet Union first. Through 2 months later, January 1958, we are able to put a satellite into space. Now, for some of you, we look at this and say, that's just 4 months later. But the Soviet Union was first. We have to skip a little bit of time and we get to September of 1959. And in September of 1959, the first probe of the moon is completed. Now, I know what you're asking yourself. What country did this first? What country was actually able to probe the moon first? The Soviet Union. As you can see here, all of the firsts in the space race were done by the Soviet Union. President of the United States at this time, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was a war hero from World War II, went to Congress and said, look, we're getting beat. The Soviet Union is beating us. We can't allow this. And he asked Congress, even though it's a local power, a state power, he asked Congress to invest millions of dollars into the U.S. education system, especially in the fields of math and science. A year and a half later, April 1961, the first person orbits the Earth. A person successfully breaks through the atmosphere and orbits the Earth. That person, a citizen of the Soviet Union. And not only is the Soviet Union able to put this person into space, but they also have the knowledge and the technology to bring this person back safely to the Earth. May 1961, just a month later, the first American orbits the Earth. We're catching up. 1966, 5 years later. Remember, we're not looking at everything. We don't have time to look at everything. 1966, the Soviet Union lands a spacecraft on another planet. The first country to do that, the planet of Venus. 5 years later, we're able to do that. We land a vehicle on Mars. December 1968. The first people to orbit the moon. Travel all the way to the moon. Have the technology and the ability to go all the way to the moon and orbit the moon. Surprise! What were we able to do within a decade? Within a decade, we were able to beat the Soviet Union at something. And when it came to the space race, we were the first to orbit someone around the moon. 7 months later, the first man is put on the moon. Again, completed by the United States. We are the only country ever to put a person on the moon. The Soviet Union said the only reason they didn't do it is because they cared about their cosmonauts, astronauts too much, that they wouldn't risk their lives doing that. In April of 1971, the first space station was put into orbit around the Earth. It was completed and built and completed by the Soviet Union. Another first for the Soviet Union. The Salyut space station. 3 years later, in 1974, we put our own space station into orbit. And we used that space station until 1979. Now today, there's an international space station that orbits the Earth. But in 1971, the Soviet Union put the space station into space, and then 3 years later, we put a space station into orbit around the Earth. And then 1975, as you'll see next week, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union began to ease. And in 1975, for the first time ever, there was a joint mission. We launched astronauts into space. The Soviet Union launched cosmonauts into space. And the two ships hooked up. They came together in outer space in 1975. That means we shared technology, and they shared technology with us. It's the only way you can have these two ships meet together. The Apollo-Soyuz project.